So it is a no secret of mine that I'm not the biggest fan of anime as a whole, but I will eventually capitulate and watch something if I get bugged enough by friends. And with Steins Gate, I'm actually glad that that happened, as I am a huge fan of philosophy and shows that make you think. Steins Gate is just that, a show that asks what appears to be a simple question. But as viewers, we're about to find out that this is no simple question at all. And they're asking, quite simply put, do we have free will? Now, when it comes to free will, I understand that we don't even want to consider the idea that we may not have it at all. But unfortunately, with much of philosophy, that supports that very thought. And for those that say that, well, philosophy has no place in the modern world, well, I would say firstly that great things are accomplished when the philosophical meets the scientific. And secondly, even modern science tends to lean towards the same conclusion. But despite all this, there's one common thread between both opposing ideologies that can agree on. They can agree about one simple thing, and that is that we feel like we are in control of our actions or our decisions. Now, I can already hear the complaints and people turning off the video saying, well, what does this have to do with a show like Steins Gate? It's a story about time travel. And well, they're correct. Normally, nothing. Most time travel stories typically ignore the philosophical theories that Steins Gate addresses and instead focuses on solely just on the butterfly effect, if they bother to focus on anything at all as the vast majority just ignore it entirely, because considering once you get into time travel, everything starts getting complicated. Steins Gate did do the butterfly effect. This is important to understand. Yes, they did it, but it was a side effect of the main thesis. The butterfly effect is not the thesis itself. And the more I watched, the more I was noticing that this is not just a story built around the John Titor story of the early 2000s, which, yes, was something that actually happened both in universe of the Steins Gate and in our real life out there. If you're interested in it, you should really look it up on there. It's a very interesting story. But to get back to the point is that Steins Gate is also built around, I'm going to butcher this philosopher's name, but it's Heidegger's being and time. Steins Gate continues to explore throughout the entire story the law of causality versus the will to power and what it means to be. So with the long introduction out of the way, we now need to discuss the story of Steins Gate, and that means following the mad scientist Okabe's experiments throughout the story. These experiments are all sparked after the death of a young girl named Krisu and the accidental time travel by Okabe. However, he quickly learns that this is no ordinary time travel, as he himself retains the memories of the previous timeline. Yet some of the parameters have in fact changed. They end up calling this the reading Steiner ability. But in this instance, instead of the lecture on time travel resulting in Krisu's death, Krisu is now giving a lecture on how time travel isn't possible and even survives to join them in their research. And it is upon seeing this and seeing her turn up at the Future Gadget Lab that Okabe figures out, well, they have in fact invented a time machine. All the Future Gadget Lab members figure out over trial and error, using bananas in their what's called the phone microwave, are trying to figure out how their time machine works, and they notice that it was caused by chance that they were able to send a message or an email or text message to the past. They end up trying to figure out a name for this, and they settle on the D-mail after the DeLorean from the Back to the Future series. Now, it does not take long for Okabe to learn the theory of the world lines, or as I call it, the branches in time. I'm not going to make this video a year long explaining this theory, because considering Steins Gate actually gets the science pretty accurate here, to the point that the time travel theory that they have in here is actually considered scientifically plausible. I'll explain this in simpler terms for the sake of video length and also for everyone's sanity. Think of each world line as a branch or another universe identical to the one you currently reside in. There is one crucial difference. Every choice someone makes, a branch or another universe is created where the opposite choice was made. Yet in the end, every path will diverge back into each other, reaching the same end. Think of a spiral or a whirlpool. It always flows downwards towards the bottom of the sea, and yet you can swim against the currents to try to escape, to move towards the outer rings, or you can try to move with the flow and try to use the momentum to slingshot you forward back out of its pull. And that is what they are searching for. The Steins Gate, as they call it, they are looking for this escape from the whirlpool. To use our real world, or at least my world, because I can't prove that we all live in the same, there was a soldier who didn't shoot a wounded German soldier, allowing that man to survive. And yet, he eventually started the Second World War as a result. The action and the consequence. At that impasse in time, everyone, when they hear this story, then asks, well, what if the soldier shot? According to this theory, he did. He made that exact choice in another branch in time. Steins Gate takes this theory, and they ask the question, well, if each timeline is set based on an action or decision made, and all other paths are chosen, well then, did we actually choose when we were greeted at the crossroads of a decision? Or are we just determined to follow the path that is set, making the choice nothing more than the illusion of choice? I understand that this is a very dark thing to think about, and so I won't be surprised if many people start clicking off the video here, especially considering if the answer of yes to this question, well then what? And this answer of yes is called determinism. And this is the theory or doctrine that acts of the will, occurrences in nature, and psychological phenomenon are casually determined by preceding events or natural law. Few people would disagree here with that the idea that actions hold consequences and that the world is governed by cause and effect, as we would call the law of causality. If a man is hungry due to not eating lunch and he chooses to satiate the hunger by eating, let's say, a banana, was that not a choice? Or was that just cause and effect? Is this man not free? Steins Gate goes through the countless quotes on determinism and even fatalism, and yes, these are slightly different. Even going as far as having Krisu say that something must have caused Mayuri's death, and that was her own birth. She goes on into details and discusses how every event needs a cause to occur. Okabe calls this out and rejects this notion instantly. Yet, the show talks about how nothing is coincidence. Everything is inevitable. The exact thesis behind determinism. And as the future gadget lab men go in with the time machine, they learn just what kind of effects meddling with the past can have when Mayuri is murdered by CERN and Okabe goes from branch to branch or world line to world line, trying everything he can think of to change the events and save his childhood friend. And yet, no matter what he does, all the branches of time still spiral into the abyss. This exact timing may move or change, yet fate's hand still plucks at the string. Mayuri's watch stops working, Krisu figures out what's going on, and Okabe has to watch his best friend die. Over and over and over again. Even when he removes all external measures, she's still a woman as young as 20, or however old she is in the series, she's not that old, dies of a heart attack. It must be pointed out here that Okabe and his experiments seem to have caused these events to happen. So now the question is, was it his choice? Or was he fated to follow this exact path? Krisu even says at one point that the phone microwave should not be stable, and that everything seems to be in their current location to build the very time machine. Their landlord is also a puppet for CERN, who in one branch orders the death of Mayuri. And most damning of all is that even after fixing all of the demails, Okabe has to go back and be the one who kills Krisu, causing the events of the story to even begin. If you go back to the first words that Krisu says in the story to Okabe, you notice this spiral in action. She asks, "What did you want to say to me about 15 minutes ago? You look sad and torn apart." Yet Okabe has never met her in his life. And it is here that you see that every divergent branch on the spiral of time returns to the same end. Determinism is present in the Steins Gate universe. But they are not done asking questions, and if you are tiring of all of these endless questions, all I can say is welcome to philosophy. This is what we do here. We ask questions. So the question remains, what does this mean for their free will? Most people would think that, well, with determinism, this question is asked and answered. But it is one that splits each of the philosophical and the modern science in half. Each side split in half, with one arguing that we don't, and the other arguing that we do. Yet neither has found the absolute truth. To move away from Steins Gate for a second, I want to talk about a recent debate that I had. Well, I wouldn't really call it a debate, as I had just used the Socratic method to learn more about the neurological perspective on the subject. Now, the neuroscientific perspective being taught is that we actually have no concept of free will, as our actions are already determined by our brains before we physically or even mentally enact on them. Now, my new friend here gave me the name of a textbook on the subject called The Mind's Machine Foundation of Brain and Behavior. This describes the behavioral parts' meanings in terms of neural science. But he also gave me an important caveat, and that was that this is disputed, as some would call it physical action, whereas others define it as internal biological actions along cognition and physical actions. Now, I know that I've lost a lot of you, and I partially did not fully get this at the beginning, so don't feel bad if you didn't. But it was here that I was intrigued by my new friend, and had a question pop into my mind upon hearing this. Well, is the brain then not what makes the person them? To which he expertly refuted this by pointing out that there was a study of a man whose name currently eludes me, who had a pole or a rail spike go right through his head, destroying his frontal lobe. The man was still alive. He survived and even lived on. But everything about him completely changed, i.e., he was no longer himself. This raised a great point in the favor of the lack of free will, as it's hard to argue with a man who changes so thoroughly. Yet it did not satiate my question, as something did not sit right. If the man's brain was in fact firing on all cylinders, but a portion no longer could it be that part of him was broken, yet still there, and he would still feel it, much like the phantom limb syndrome of the amputees? Fortunately, I didn't ask him this question, so the scientific rebuttal still remains unanswered, as does the philosophical question that leads into what can change the nature of a man. Both of these I didn't ask, and both you won't be able to find. Instead, I asked him if his brain injury did change him to the point that his brain was firing completely new decisions before he could mentally or physically act, then what was still governing his actions? Even if it is just causality or determinism, neurologically, the subconscious mind has decided before the conscious mind thinks and even acts. We still, though, feel like we have decided through our conscious mind, and so we have to find a definition. And as we can't really continue this discussion without first defining what free will is. We both assumed that the hypotheses that we had found so far were to be the truth, and yet we had a feeling that it was not quite the be all and end all. For if it was, well, then why would my subconscious mind decide to allow my conscious mind to debate a decision for hours or days or even weeks and years on end? Could it be undecided? And if so, does that mean that I have some will over its power? And it is here that we both got stuck once again and asked, well, could the subconscious mind's neurological decisions be our free will? Or could the subconscious mind be determinism? Well, our conscious mind is the free will, able to act along its path. So with that debate, we're going to return here to Steins gate, as it was put in to illustrate how the concept of determinism is not as cut and dry as it seems, and that the search for the definition of free will becomes endless, both philosophically and scientifically. So instead, we will use the principle of alternative possibilities to define it, as this principle defines free action as one where the chooser could have chosen differently had they otherwise did. Now, that might sound a little confusing, so here's an example. If you decided to wake up early this morning, you would have had free will just as easily as you would have had you chosen to sleep in. Armed with this definition and where my debate ended, we must now ask if the conscious mind is free will and the subconscious determinism. And if it is true, can they coexist? I understand that most people would hear determinism and say, well, no, determinism means that it's determined. Yet, even amongst the scientific and the philosophic, again, this splits. Those who think that free will and determinism are compatible are called compatibilists, while those who believe otherwise are called incompatibilists. Now, the compatibilists make the claim that just because your choices can be predetermined, this does not mean that they are still not choices. Now, apologies as I'm going to butcher this man's name, as William Gottfried Leibniz was a theologist who believed that the world we live in right now was created by God to be the best of all possible worlds. That God created it this way, already having all of the information and knowing the outcomes from every possible action and decision. He spoke that your choices have already been predetermined by an omnipotent God before the universe even began. And yet, despite all of this, he still believed that we have free will to make the choices, even though God has seen all of the outcomes. Now, I get that not everybody wants to hear a compatibilist argument to revolve around an omnipotent and omnipresent God. Yet, I disagree. I think that we should hear from their theories, as be considering great things again are accomplished when the theologists meet with the scientific. We wouldn't have the Gregorian calendar named after Pope Gregory if it was not for the Pope to work with the scientific community to develop it. But I get it. I get why people don't. I disagree, but I get it. So we're going to look towards David Hume, who thought that human actions were free because they were caused by our desires, which are spurned by determinism, caused by the physical laws and the laws of causality. Yet despite this, the actions a person takes in order to respond are completely your own. If you are hungry, well, that is predetermined. Yet your choice is in the what. The what may be guided based on the current state of hunger, past enjoyment of the chosen food, but it is still a free choice. Hume even goes as far as to say that we are not free unless determinism is true, pointing out that what we consider to be the reason why we do things are also the type of things that can be caused by something outside of our control. And if the free choices are just the ones that someone seems to do for no reason, then how can we say that that is us? Who is choosing them? On the other hand, if my character traits, upbringing, desires, beliefs, and so forth are the explanation of my choices, is that not more connected with who we are? So armed with this, it would appear that the characters in Steins gate actually follows the theory of compatibilism, both having free will in that they are in control of their destinies, and yet the ends are predetermined. they can only really choose the path. This is further proven by the butterfly effect references between the branches throughout the show. If the characters' actions were truly out of their control, then why would the author show us each separate branch from time jumps to demails? Are each of these not choices? And each of these ward lines, did they not have consequences and yet reach the same end? But each ward line was a choice in itself. So with this question, we must now play devil's advocate, the incompatibilist one, those who think that determinism and free will are not compatible. And even amongst this group, they fracture into two separate camps, those rejecting determinism as a whole and those rejecting free will. And since this video is long enough, and I believe that Steins Gate does not really support the argument that free will exists on its own without determinism, we'll focus on the path that rejects free will. If you believe the opposite, I would love to read the apologia in the comments below. Now, when looking at the classical incompatibilist argument, which says that no one can do otherwise than one actually does, we must then assume that no one acts of their own free will. We must suffer from the illusion of choice, but the choice itself does not exist. Which, as you can imagine, is where the compatibilist groups have an objection. Taking the story of Steins Gate, we have the original or main branch or world line, Okabe, already knowing what sub-branch Okabe would have to do to save Mayuri and Chrissy. It would appear that he wasn't really able to do any action that would stop the predetermined events from occurring. He may successfully move the date of the events back, but the event could not be stopped. Despite his best efforts, Mayuri will still die, even from a heart attack, as if some death god is up in the sky eating an apple willing it. According to this, he doesn't really have free will. He has the Steiner reading ability, where he can see all the different paths, in which case he would be technically all-knowing, yet not all-powerful. Democritus, who is one of the oldest philosophers that we have, actually inspired Heidegger. He supported the idea of what's called reductionism, which is the idea that all the paths of the world and our own experiences can actually be traced back or reduced down to a single event or thing. The atoms in the world exploding from stars that eventually formed, forming planets and life. And yet, all of this originated from one theory called the Big Bang. If you were to follow the path of every atom's movement, you could theoretically find this initial starting point in the Big Bang itself. And if you could find that, you should be able to follow and theoretically follow the pattern and the movements of every single atom. And if you could do that, you could theoretically predict the future. To ground this theory into reality, we have to really take this and put it into the practical world to see if we can follow the pattern. And to do that, you only really need to look at the billiards table. The balls only move when a cue strikes the cue ball into the others, sending them flying across the table. In the hands of a skilled player, we've all seen the pool shark, who can accurately predict the movement of each ball and where their cue ball will land based on their strike. Assuming they never err in their strikes, could they then not be considered to be predicting the future? A good point that is brought up by those that follow this creed is, why are we above the laws of the universe? What makes this ape so special? Everything in the universe must follow the laws of nature, and it would be arrogant to believe that we were somehow above these laws and the only beings with free will. So what does this mean? Well, does everything have it? Or is it just a byproduct of being alive? And no, I am not going into a tangent on what is alive. This video is long enough, and we don't need to get into that philosophical concept. Or is it that nothing has free will, and we are just at the mercy of some original event that set every ball into motion beyond our control? That some cue struck the cue ball, and we're just the billiards on the table. Steins Gate shows us this very theory, with Okabe being the only one to go back in and kill Krisu, setting the motion of the very first demail without him even knowing it. Listen to the very last line of the show. He says that this is the choice of Steins Gate. Not their choice, but the choices of whatever the things set in motion determined the path. These are the last words of a man that has learned that he has no choice in the original story. All his choices were made for him. His reading Steiner ability was granted only to him, allowing him to remember and know every time branch, and every branch led to the same conclusion. Now, I can hear a chorus of execration, but there is no World War III. Okabe stopped it. To which I reply, did he? Did they find the Steins Gate? I would bet to differ, and claim that they were merely entering onto a branch further up the spiral of time, where the war would still happen. Remember back to the original story that I had told you earlier, of the soldier who didn't shoot. In the world that he shot, well, would the Weimar Civil War still happen? Yes. It was a direct result of the end of the actual collapse of the German Empire and the rise of socialism inside of it. And was also caused, not just the cause, but could have been the cause of the Depression, and actually helped spark World War II. Because within the Great Depression, people needed people to blame, and so they just found a group to blame. Especially it was easy when one side was involved in a civil war. Point to them. And that's kind of what happened. The same demon would not have risen up to power, as he would have been shot and dead in the trenches. But the same venomous spider webs were so astutely woven were already there. A different demon's name would just mar the tombstone. And the Second World War would have happened had he been the soldier who shot. That man was not alone. It is important to remember. Other players were involved in the game. Steins Gate is no different, as it has shown us that you can't change the end of the spiral of time, that every world branch, every world line will diverge back to a singular point. You might not be able to see the end, and yet Okabe was not the only one working on the time machine. You had CERN that was working on it. Chrissy's father assumed others were doing the very same, as you have Russia and you have the actual Americans that were going forth. You have the professor in the actual Steins Gate Zero. Someone, somewhere, would have cracked the code. Who's to say that inside of this same world line that they have entered, the so-called alpha or beta world line that they have entered into, that the professor doesn't figure out how to crack into the Amadeus system and use Chrissy's exact thoughts and build off of her thesis, or that someone else doesn't take that and figure it out. Who's to say that this theory of time travel was not cracked by another? There are other players in this game. None of them were alone, and that these spider webs were still so astutely woven. Time in this world is like a spiral, and they merely rode a branch up in the whirlpool. It will still diverge right back down. So I hope that this made a lot of people think on there, as this show really did make me think, and this was based off of the first viewing. If you guys made it this far, please let me know if I made a mistake anywhere, or if you disagree. I would really love to read about that. And if you enjoyed it, then if you wouldn't mind going down to the link below and picking me up a coffee. If you believe that the world is predetermined, well, then you will have already bought me a coffee. And if you believe that you have free will, well, then you might just be a prick if you decide not to pick me up a coffee. But if you... I'm joking, obviously. I would appreciate any support that people can have, as this took a while to make and break apart, as you can vastly imagine. With that, though, I hope you guys enjoyed this, and it made some people think, and people can develop even more theories based off of it. With that, take care, everyone.